The purpose of Wealth Talk is to educate, inform, and hopefully entertain you on the subject of building your wealth. WealthBuilders recommends you should always take independent financial, tax, or legal advice before making any decisions around your finances.
Hello, welcome to episode 33 of Wealth Talk. My name's Christian Rodwell, the Membership Director for WealthBuilders, and I'm joined by the founder, Mr. Kevin Whelan.
Good afternoon, Chris. Pleasure to talk to you just before we hit the weekend.
Here we are once again. The weeks, they just come around so quickly, don't they?
It's shockingly quick, isn't it? And actually, you know, what's interesting is we're having to revisit some content today.
We are indeed. We are actually the first time, I think, that we're kind of revisiting a topic that we covered back in Wealth Talk episode 11. And the title of that podcast was Creating Leverage Using First, the FIRST model, or the acronym there that I know you've created, Kevin, to help people really get to grips with the 5 different types of leverage that exist.
Yeah, absolutely. Leverage is a key aspect of wealth. And I'm going to go pretty bold, Chris, and say it's almost, the word, almost impossible to create wealth without leverage.
Well, I mean, that's a bold statement. And remember you said on, the previous episode, Wealth Talk 11, it's the key in terms of building wealth. It's that critical. So perhaps we should recap what the FIRST stand for anyone who might be listening today hasn't heard episode 11.
Yeah, but before I do that, I'd just like to say why I think it's the case, and then we can dive in and just do a very quick resume of FIRST. But, the reason why leverage is critical is because for the vast majority of people, they live an unleveraged life. The reason why 95% of the population don't make it to financial independence because they do everything in the slow lane. It'd be like trying to drive from London, where we are, to Newcastle, where I'm from, and do everything in first gear. We get there, wouldn't we? But our car would be knackered and he would be slow. And this is the way that most people are doing it. So in other words, they're trading time for money in a job or in a business that's trading time for profit. And there's no leverage in that. There's no recurring, automatic, asset-based income, generally speaking. And then the money gets parked in the stock market, which again doesn't provide any form of leverage. It just goes up and down and sideways. So there's a mathematical restriction on what can actually happen in the stock market, and more than happy to be tested on that. And the long-term returns, net of all charges, probably in the region of sort of 4 to 6%. And you can't really build wealth on that. You need a massive amount of money, and therefore it takes a lifetime. And the reason why most people start working at 20 and finish at 60 or 65 is it takes them that long to get to a place of being even reasonably okay financially. And I'm just going to argue, Chris, that's too bloody slow. It's not interesting. It's too slow. It's unengaging. It doesn't involve any creativity, and it certainly doesn't involve all of the different forms of leverage that it's possible to use. And as we have been talking to our own students, Chris, in the foundation program, got 109 students working through that right now. And I think what we're finding is they're getting a bit of overwhelm and a little bit of confusion from time to time, not everybody. And I think it all comes down to a very clear picture on the subject of leverage. And it just means getting more for less, getting a better outcome for what you've already got using your own resources, and also, where possible, recognizing that it's possible to use other people's resources. And what I mean by resources is the 5 forms of leverage. So if you want me to jump into those 5, Chris, just even as a quick reminder, say people having to listen to a whole podcast, you want me to go ahead and do that?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's kick off with the F.
Well, F stands for financial, okay? So financial resources or anything that really have a monetary value, or they could have a monetary value. So simply put, it's using money in your home, it's using money in your pension, money in your savings, money in your investments, money that's existing in your life that you can apply a process to make that work much, much harder than by simply allocating it into the relative neutrality of the stock market. And the most popular form of that by far, Chris, is debt leverage, which is very simply put, taking some money and then topping it up with other people's money in order to be able to control and own another asset, which creates more income. So in a very simple sense, if you could imagine a property that you buy for a couple of £100,000, but you put £20,000 as a deposit and you borrow the rest, then £20,000 is controlled an asset worth 200,000. So if that property goes up by 10%, you've got a 10 times return on your initial capital. So it's very important to recognize that it enhances the decisions that you're making for the positive. But equally, certainly with debt leverage, it can work against you as well, because if property prices go down, it can wipe out your capital. Now, these are simple mathematical things to get in your head, but it's important to recognize that well-structured, well-organized, and carefully thought through leverage can accelerate your wealth massively, provided you couple that with risk management. So in other words, you don't just unfetter your money and let it loose. You've got to recognize that financial leverage certainly cuts both ways, but many forms of leverage, Chris, don't cut anything in any other way but for the positive. So only really financial leverage is a negative, or it can be a negative, which is why you have to pay attention to it. But other in forms of leverage actually always work for the positive.
Okay. So that would take us to the second, which is I, and I know that stands for intellect, or we could say interest even.
Absolutely. Everyone's got some form of intellect. The fact that they're being paid for work, whether it's paid for profit or paid for a job. And I think I mentioned, I don't know if it was on that podcast or not, Chris, it's important to try and understand, what that intellect is worth, and what I think we'll cover that more in the time leverage. But everybody's got something, some measure of value that they already bring. And I always suggest when people do that, they combine this intellectual view of themselves together with this wonderful tool we use called Wealth Dynamics, and see what would be logical for them to bring to the table because they already know it. And, we were talking to somebody recently in the foundation where, they've had a lot of experience with accountancy, but they hadn't really thought about bringing that to the business pillar, or somebody else who's a surveyor and hadn't really thought about bringing it front and center to the property pillar, or somebody who's brilliant at relationships, they're outstanding at team building, but weren't thinking about building teams in their wealth, and they're trying to do it all on their own. So it's important that you look at what you're brilliant at, what you're great at, and you reflect that in your wealth dynamic, in your wealth building plan, wherever you can. And in addition, reflect your new level of interest, whatever you're thinking about doing now that fascinates you, or it fuels some level of fascination now. And this is the intellectual leverage that often we try and get people to think about using what they've done before. Don't start right from the beginning like a newbie and starting from scratch.
And I've seen in many cases, actually, when people have been in a job for a long time and perhaps they're becoming slightly disillusioned with where they've been, they sometimes just want to get away completely from that environment, and they forget the wonderful skills and experiences and intellect that they have there. And as you say, that's often an overlooked area, which you can perhaps take out of that previous, employee environment and use that to your own benefit in your own business.
Oh, absolutely right. Absolutely right. And, so that's definitely something that we will often try and help people. The fastest way to begin your wealth journey is not to learn everything brand new, but to bring some of what you already know. And that's definitely a key area of building wealth. The third area is the R, Chris, which is for relationship. And relationship is really critical because, there's a whole combination of these things. So I find myself being tempted to bring in other aspects of leverage when I'm talking about any one of them. And it's really important as we're kind of midway through just to recognize that leverage compounds upon leverage. So your financial leverage links to your intellectual leverage. If you've got some money and you're already an expert in it, then you can combine them both. If you're great at building relationships, or you're in a position where somebody has some knowledge that you want to seek. Actually, I'll make a point, Chris. There's a big difference between information and knowledge. And I think that's probably quite a key distinction to make just before I get into the relationship one. So often people will know that if they want to learn something, what's the first place they do, Chris? What's the very first thing that most people do?
Well, they will find some education of some sort. So
they'll Google it, right? Can I Google how to do that? And there's a world of difference between getting some information which is academic or which is distilled from the internet and actually where you combine that with experience with people who put that to work. And that's what I mean by relationships. So often if you want to learn something new, then let's take an example of a property strategy, Chris, anybody could pick one. Instead of just reading the book or doing a course, you can couple that academic reading with the real experience of someone who's bringing that to life. So they're doing it every day. They've not just made the knowledge work or the information work. They've turned that into an experience. They've turned that into real value, and they've made distinctions and distilled it. They've got connections. They've got new ways to do things, to interpret this. And seeking out those people, particularly in a community of wealth where so many people are willing sharers, the number of people I see continuing to try and build their wealth in a kind of DIY way, when it's so much easier, so much quicker, so much more fun, and so less risky if you can bring a great relationship to bear. Now, how does that turn into negative leverage? It can't. If somebody brings knowledge and experience to you, and in many cases they'll share that with you, then that can only enhance the relationship for both sides. So, relationships are a very key part of that. And whatever wealth dynamic you have, it's important to recognize that collaborating and working with others is the fastest way to bring that intellectual leverage together with the financial one. So often we combine financial with intellect, with relationship, and turn that into a new plan for wealth. And I think that's sometimes where we find people missing that bit. They're just wanting to do, especially those who like to study, they want to do more academics. And you can't really do that. You can get into overwhelm so quickly by trying to learn everything before you do anything. So it's definitely better to think about that relationship piece and try and have somebody show you what to do, and recognize that you're going to be a giver too. As you develop your knowledge and experience, you share too. And it's one of the embedded values in the Wealth Builder system, Chris, to be willing to both share with people behind you on the journey and accept help from people ahead of you.
That's right. And on the subject of relationships, we're seeing that, aren't we, within our foundation Facebook group with the members that are meeting up, in similar locations and getting face to face and sharing what they're up to, and creating the buddy groups, which we have inside the foundation as well. So yeah, the relationships are super important.
I mean, we've often said, Chris, haven't we, that whenever you feel like you're bumping against your comfort zone, or you're reaching a point where your capacity to know something isn't there, there's always a who on the end of that what question. And the who is always the relationship. So being open and willing to sort of seek out and accept relationships. And the whole idea behind our students is they come to us to try and help them accelerate those relationships, to distill the relationships down to people who can genuinely help them, rather than kind of randomly hoping they might bump into people at a networking meeting of this or a networking meeting of that. So I think it's really important to stress that if anyone's building wealth, to try and get into a community which is sharing and where those connections are distilled in a trusted environment, rather than a place where people see you as a new person and seeking simply to profit from you, which always makes me a bit worried.
So the S stands for systems.
It does. Now, systems is a tricky one, because usually you're systemizing something after you've started. So you can't just systemize something before you get going. So the system leverage, which again is always going to cut in your favor, allows you to think about some actions that you're taking that you're beginning to hone. And then when you hone them, you learn much more about how to turn the work that is needed to be done to create the wealth into something that can be replicated. Now, whether that's in business, we will often hear about people saying work on the business, not in it. And the whole idea behind that is if you can systemize everything that you do and almost write a operations manual and begin it right from the beginning as you started, then it won't be long before everything that is possible to do, you've already got a system for it. And if you've got a system for it, you can teach it. If you can teach it, you can delegate it. If you can delegate it, it doesn't depend on you. And if it doesn't depend on you, you've got an asset. And then that asset can be sold, it can be leased, it can be used, it can be purposed to continue to create wealth. It's a tough one because you've got to get started first. What I find is the opposite is many people want a system before they start. And it isn't possible to do that because you've got to get involved to know what that system is. You might have heard a previous podcast, Chris, people talking about service accommodation, for example, and saying, well, I don't really want to be a manager of that. And one of our contributors said, you may not want to be the manager, but you need to learn what needs to be done so you can systemize it. And then you bring your own personality, which is an intellect, and you bring your own processes in systems to make all of that work. So again, it's leverage upon leverage, feeding leverage, which is just, this whole combination of things, which is why it's so critical, Chris, to get started. Because getting started starts to bring the leverage into play. But the thing we hear more than anything else is, I don't have the time. Some people still say to me, hey, Kevin, I'm really interested in being wealthy, but I don't have the time. Well, I'm afraid it don't work that way. In all forms of leverage, you've got to invest time before you get the benefit of the leverage. Do you know what I mean by that?
I do, but perhaps you can explain further.
Well, think in simple terms. If you were doing something really simple, like if you were looking to harvest a crop, what do you have to do first? You have to sow the seed, you have to let it grow, you have to harvest it. So you put all that money in way, way, way before you get the crop, but you have to understand that. Once you understand it, then you know that you have to make an investment before you get the outcome. And I see too many people want the outcome before they're willing to make the investment. And it doesn't work that way. Nothing in any form of leverage works that way. You have to spend the money and time up front before you get the outcome, which is why it's great to be taught what the value of your leverage will be, what will be that outcome, so you can decide if it's a worthwhile investment or not. Because in the end, all wealth is about contributing to a total figure that each person would want to be completely financially independent. And if you're trying to do that in 5 years or 6 years and 7 years, not wait a lifetime, there is some investment up front. And that investment is always a little bit of money and a little bit of time. And the two must be regarded as an investment, not as a cost, because it's very easy to focus on cost, not on value. And obviously we try and avoid those people, Chris. We call them the drifters, don't we? And we don't like people who keep drifting, expecting everything for free and expecting everything is on a plate when it is not. The other thing about the issue of time, Chris, is when people say to me, I'm interested, but I don't have the time, is I would always ask people to reconnect with their purpose, reconnect with their reason why. Because if the reason why is strong enough, then that's a form of leverage. It's in your mind again. It's intellectual leverage, but your reason why will propel you and be unstoppable if it's strong enough. If it isn't strong enough, anything will derail you. A slight mishap will derail you. So it's really important as you start to think about that is to find enough time to get started. This is the most important form of leverage of all, because with time, you're giving permission for the other forms of leverage to come and play. Without time, you can't do any of it. See what I mean? If you don't give it time, you can't bring the financial leverage into play. You don't think about your intellect. You don't build relationships. You'll never, ever take the time and effort to create a system to try and duplicate something and replicate something. So you always have to find the time, which is why we love the podcast, Chris, because that's leverage time. And we're always about trying to create as many ways as possible to save people time, whether it's earmarking time in their life when they've got downtime. Because if you think about it, how much productive time do you think people spend, Chris? When if you imagine someone's got a job, and we'll use that example, and they're working 40 hours a week, and let's say they're on a good salary, let's say they're on 100 grand, that's the equivalent of £50 an hour. So take any salary, halve it, that's the value of a job. But then there's all this unpaid commute maybe, and then so you're spending so much time. So the amount of hours that people will spend productively to build wealth, in many cases, in a week, is zero. If you're not sure about that, why don't you take the next 7 days before you hear the podcast again and just document how much time are you spending in a week, in that 1 week, where the activity that you're engaged in is actually building your wealth. And that's my point, that if there's so little time to do it, then any time you can find is leverage. Any time will give the other forms of leverage permission. So if you can find half an hour, find half an hour. If you can find an hour, find an hour. Do you remember in the last podcast, Chris, I talked about the idea of creating a business in your mind?
We did. We were talking about legacy. Yeah.
And sort of, creating a virtual business. And I was talking to one of our clients today, and he was saying to me that the kids have created, oh, actually, no, let me correct myself. He said he's paid one of the kids, 14-year-old, 20 quid, right? So nice one, to design the logo for the family business they call Five Oaks. Okay, not Seven Oaks, Five Oaks. And that's fun. They're bringing that in. But the point is not paying the kid 20 quid to get them involved, but to think about a name that brings some value to you, so that when you use your tool, your calendar, in whatever way, you put Five Oaks time in there, or what was yours, Team Rodwell, or whatever it was, I think it was. So you can create time in your diary and put it in there as if it was an appointment, but the appointment's with yourself, and that's a critical aspect of building wealth. And we think good leverage is probably a couple of hours a week. Medium leverage would be an hour a week. If you've got less than an hour a week, it's going to be very, very difficult to build and enhance your leverage points from there. So as we were thinking, Chris, we created kind of a matrix of leverage, didn't we, in terms of amount of finance available, amount of time able to build relationships, and the level of connection people had, and their willingness to engage, and also the strong level of intellect or interest that they've got in something now. And you can almost, by talking to someone, the way we do it, we can try and work out and almost always identify the best form of leverage to use today to start with the time to start building the wealth, to overcome the pain which is overwhelm. And that's the purpose of bringing this episode together, to help somebody out there overcome the overwhelm, because that's what's stopping people, because there's too much information out there. It's too easy to think, oh, I haven't got loads of time. Find half an hour. Anybody should be able to find half an hour or an hour in a week. And that's what I'm hoping that this podcast will do, by asking people to think about what they're doing.
It's been a good recap of the FIRST, which, as we say, we initially covered on Wealth Talk 11, and specifically over the last few weeks with our founder members, we've found that we needed to dive a little deeper into this, didn't we? You just touched on the matrix that we put together there in one of our foundation webinars earlier this month. So perhaps for listeners, Kevin, it'd be good to maybe try and give a couple of examples, and maybe we can tie this into the 7 pillars as almost like a checklist of, how do you really look at your life right now and say, well, where are my potential points of leverage? And as we've said before, if there is no leverage, then it's going to be very, very difficult to build your wealth, isn't it?
It's always possible to find some form of financial leverage. Okay. So, when anyone's doing an undertaking a stock take of their financial assets, they can look at the forgotten money in the equity, sometimes even in the capacity, right? So I don't know which podcast that was, Chris, when we talked about home capacity, but the number of our students who've, taken a room, used the rent a room scheme, generating whatever it is, 7.5 grand tax free, and that 7.5 grand pays for any intellectual time they need to invest in themselves to build, the knowledge they need to take their wealth to the next level. So sometimes it could be really as simple as that. Another way would be to create. I think we had again we alluded last week. One of our students is bringing their kids to set up a regular. What was it? Car booting, Chris, and then you take the money and you can apply that money and say, well, I'll invest that money into premium bonds, or I can invest that money in the stock market. It's always possible to find a few extra pounds that you can then just immediately start working in the stock market or something that just shows a result. So that something's happening. Now, okay, I know I said the stock market isn't a place of leverage, but sometimes it's the time leverage you get by showing yourself that you've now got a few £1,000. If you didn't have any, if you've already got £100,000 or more, there's simply nothing should hold you back. 100,000 in your pension, or £100,000 in savings, or £100,000 in some assets in your life, then that's high enough leverage to be able to make that work massively in one of your chosen pillars. So, that would be high leverage. Medium leverage would be, 30, 40, and low leverage would be you're just trying to find ways to use the debits. So again, you could link to the debits process, Chris, which is the process of really examining every aspect of your finances to discover some money. But then the very discovery is half the challenge. The next challenge is then whatever money you find, you put that to work into some of, at least one of the pillars. And if it's right at the beginning, it's normally pillar 3, which is investing, just to get you going. But, the whole thing just keeps working in this kind of compounded way. Any example? I mean, you're on the calls too, Chris.
Actually, had one example this week. I was speaking to someone in the office, and they said, "Oh, I was listening to one of the podcasts, and I've cancelled a subscription, £25 a month." And I said, "Well, that's handy because that £25 you can buy a premium bond now. So no matter how small it is, you can begin."
Exactly right. And what happens when you turn the wheel, and that's another aspect to this, turning wheels of wealth, and again, that's another thing. But anyway, when you're turning and you're moving, the very momentum. Think about the car analogy again, Chris. If most people, let's see if I could do justice to this. I'm doing it on the fly, so I'll do my best. Okay. So if we use the car analogy, let's say you've got a vehicle and it's parked and it's on the drive. If you're trying to be absolutely clear that everything has to be lined up, all the ducks are lined up, everything has to be understood before you go, it's like saying, I'm not going to set off until I know all the traffic lights are on green. But you can't know that. It's an uncertain world, so you have to do things with recognizing there's uncertainty. You have to get into first gear to get moving. So you get moving, but the very act of moving changes your field of vision. It changes the aspect. It changes the things around you. It gives you opportunities. I'm sure someone's been in a car, made a wrong turn, and then found something fascinating there, or just turning around and changing something, brings something back to the table that wasn't there before. So it's just a fascinating thing that when you make movement, that's leverage in itself, and it changes you, and it brings other leverage into play. It starts to change you as a person. Your brain changes, and the whole thing is about that. So I would say, anybody, please take step 1.
Well, and continuing on the car analogy there, Kevin, as you've begun, as you know, I'm looking at new cars at the moment. So there's a great app now called Get Around where people can actually rent out their car to people when it's not being used. And so, I was having a look on there and I was having a look at the Audis, and literally for £40 or whatever, I could rent that for a day, drive it around, get a good feel for it, and I could try that with a few cars. But what a great way to leverage your car if you're at work and it's sitting there and you don't have to be hands-on at all, and you can cover the cost of your insurance perhaps per month or even more.
Yeah. Well, we know there are so many ways to discover financial leverage. And again, going back to the intellect, just, what is it you're really good at? What is it you're really interested in? And start with something that's reasonable. There's no point thinking about creating a multi-million-pound business. Just start with something small and then your ideas will grow from there. So I think we got the message across, really.
So is there anything else to add then, Kevin? Because obviously we've been having many calls recently and through our observations of where someone should start or why they should be getting stuck with this topic of leverage.
It's always going to come down to overwhelm, Chris. It's going to come down to that. And I think that's the most common reason why. And I think if we've covered why you shouldn't just be seeking information and more reading, more food for thought. Stop thinking, find one form of leverage, take some form of action, put the wheels in motion and get going. That would be my advice to people who are on the podcast who are struggling. And when it comes to our own students, obviously we know the balance of their wealth dynamic, we know their finances, we know their intellect, we know their capacity or willingness to build relationships. Systems we don't worry about at the beginning. We just need to find their time, and we can work out and help them choose the right starting point. But we know that people listening on the podcast may not have the benefit of those coaching calls, Chris. But it is something that at least hopefully, in this we're giving some aspect of that. But we're opening the foundation again at some point soon, are we not?
We will be, yes. I think we did allude maybe a couple of months ago that we'd be looking at opening again in October, but I think we've decided that we'll probably delay things just until the start of next year, just so that we can give the very most time, attention and value to our existing founder members and then open the doors fresh for 2020, which I'm most definitely looking forward to.
Yeah, that'd be great. And is there a link where people can register their interest so that when we launch it, they get to know about that, Chris?
Yeah, definitely. The best place is to head to wealthbuilders.co.uk/foundation, and all the details of the program are there. And if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see some big red buttons where you can join the waiting list and just be updated as we get closer to that time of reopening.
And I think by that time, when we've been working with the current group for 9 months or so, we'll have so many case studies that we can share to enhance that. So you're just registering and being interested, you'll see the testimonials of people making dramatic differences. And sometimes, they need a reminder or two. Do you remember this week, actually, we had one of our students and we'd talked to them about finding their financial resources and their pensions. And do you remember what he said he found this week?
Do indeed. Yes, an extra £50,000.
Yeah, that's a hell of a lot of money just to find. And that's because we're prompting. So there's 10 billion or so out there in forgotten pensions. So maybe start there, look at the government tracing agency. If you've worked with a company that's no longer there, or an insurance company that's been bought out or sold to another one, there's so many different places you can find money. So revisit some of those things in debits. Chris will put a link to the show notes on debits, and hopefully we'll get some stories from people who discovered some money, found a new form of leverage, and beginning to build their wealth on their own terms.
Yeah. And if anyone listening right now, if you have questions, then there's two places. You can either head over to the Wealth Builders Facebook community that's open for everyone who wants to learn more about building wealth to join absolutely for free. And that's wealthbuilders.co.uk/Facebook. And you can post in there. If you have questions about today's episode, then myself and Kevin will be diving in there to answer those. And of course, if you want to ask a specific question to myself and Kevin, then you can head over to wealthbuilders.co.uk/WealthTalk. And there's a orange button there, and that's SpeakPipe. And you can just hit that and record a short message. And we'll pick that up and be happy to answer that on a future episode.
Well, listen, I hope the leverage of a podcast, so you can, whatever you're doing, it'd be interesting to know what people are doing. Maybe on that terrible commute of 2 hours each way, or maybe they're in the gym, or maybe they're walking the dog, whatever they're doing. just be great to know that this has stimulated you to take some form of action. Don't get caught in overwhelm. Find a form of leverage. Get yourself in first gear. Get moving. Don't make it a lifetime. Let's get you wealthy within a few years, not in 40 or 50 years. I wish you all good luck.
Thanks, Kevin. I've enjoyed it today, as always, and I look forward to catching up on the next episode of Wealth Talk.
Will do. See ya.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget that we are constantly updating our resources inside the WealthBuilders membership site to help you create, build, and protect your wealth. Head over to wealthbuilders.co.uk/membership right now for free access. That's wealthbuilders.co.uk/membership.